So Lot and his family, they are coming out of this destruction as the angels are destroying Sodom and also the cities around Sodom. You know, that we mentioned earlier that they were coming to see Sodom and Gomorrah. And then there's also the city Zoar that Lot is going to intercede for. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's other cities in this area that are part of this same oppressive culture that are all being swept up in this. The angels, they're about to destroy this city, and they say, look, it's time to get up and get out of this place. His sons-in-laws, they don't really care. Well, right after we're told that his sons-in-laws think that he's joking, in verse 15 it says that morning dawned, and then the angels said, look, okay, time to go, in verse 15.
Yeah, so what's the significance of that timestamp?
Yeah, we figured this out, actually, as we were recording last week, I think.
Yeah.
That the story starts out with Abraham at his tent in the heat of the day. So he's there in midday, and then we have the angels coming into the city in the evening, and now we have morning coming, so we're getting closer to Yahweh's deliverance. We're going to see that the sun actually comes up as Lot is entering into his safe haven during this Exodus. So, again, we've talked about in other places how, again, the sunrise is part of the Exodus motif. That's a sign of Yahweh's deliverance. It usually comes right along with Yahweh's destruction of his enemies and his rescue of his people. And so we have the beginning of this Exodus victory in this statement.
Yeah.
But after they tell him, like, look, okay, sun's coming up, it's time to go, this is about to start, he lingers and he hangs around, which, again, we just saw Abram in the last story. He had haste in trying to prepare for his guests and give them a feast and honor them. And then we also see in Exodus 12:39 that the Israelites were not able to linger, which is the same word.
Oh, interesting.
Hebrew. So again, another link where Lot is just being, he looks like an unfaithful Israelite and an unfaithful Abraham in the Exodus context.
Right. Yeah, and I see in your notes you talk about how maybe he was lingering because he was discouraged by his son-in-laws.
Right.
And I tend to think that maybe he's lingering because he's about to leave his whole life.
That too, yeah.
You know, his daughters have
That's true.
found husbands there. That he's made a home. He's a prominent man there.
And why did he come there?
Because it would
too many riches.
Yeah, it was lush, and yeah, what we saw in Ezekiel. I mean, the place was just filled with too much stuff.
Yeah. Well, too, he had too many possessions to dwell with Abraham.
Yeah.
So he comes here, and so he went in with, this entire camp of wealth, and he's coming out with himself, his wife, and his 2 daughters.
Yeah.
And the clothes on their backs.
Yeah. And his wife doesn't even make it.
Yeah. Which, that speaks to this a little more. Just, this wasn't meant to be taken as like, oh, she tripped and fell and her eyes turned back and she just happened to actually see it. And God was sitting there waiting just like, ha, I got you, bam, salt.
Right.
He turns her into a pillar of salt, but it's not like she tripped and made a mistake. This was supposed to signify, again, in this crafted narrative, it's not just writing down bland history. She turned back and looked because she wanted it. She desired it. She missed it. She counted the honor that came from men, the wealth that came from men, more than the protection and future honor that would come from Yahweh.
Yeah, and I believe Jesus in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 17, he's talking to his disciples about what the world would be like when he returns, and he describes a world that will be like the days of Noah and like the days of Lot. And so it's interesting, he makes a connection between Lot and Noah there too.
Yep.
But then he goes on to say, he says, on that day, no one who is on the roof of his house with his goods inside should go down to get them. Likewise, no one in the field should go back for anything. Remember Lot's wife. And I think he's implying there that she didn't just glance back, but that she went back.
She turned back.
She turned back. And even the language... My understanding is the language in Genesis 19, what's being communicated there is not so much that she looked back at Sodom, but that she looked away from Lot, that her gaze turned away from him. She stopped following him. And so it seems like, yeah, like you said, this is not just an accident that, oops, I looked back and now God's this evil, mean person, but she was forsaking Yahweh's wisdom, and she's going back to what she truly loved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe no one's thinking that, like, okay, this was just an accident, but I like to try and read, at least when I'm thinking about how to talk about the Bible, read as a skeptic, so that I know how to talk to the skeptic about. Because there are plenty of people out there who will say, like, this is an instant of God just being off, like, unhinged,
right,
just flying off the handle. And it's like, well, let's not just say, okay, you're wrong and you're dumb. Let's actually read along with them and then try to point out, like, what's going on in this text.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. In John Walton's commentary, he talks about this situation, and he makes an argument for her going back to Sodom. And he argues that, well, with what's described in the destruction of Sodom, there may have been numerous, quote, pillars of salt that that everybody went back.
I think that area, it's full of, I know it's a very salty area because it's in the Dead Sea area, and I think the ground, you can't grow anything there because it's salty, but I think there's also in places like rocky pillars that are like salty, and so I wonder if this wasn't also playing off some kind of like, we've seen Genesis so far play off of a lot of myths from other cultures and show how Yahweh's on top of it. If this is like taking a folktale about how the salt got there and putting Yahweh at the top of it as well.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting.
Completely spitballing. But,
Right.
I could see the author of Genesis doing that. So let's go back to Lot's escape in verse 17, since we talked a little bit about his wife and her motives and ultimately her disloyalty to Lot. You mentioned that she took her eyes off of Lot, and for her, he was kind of the elect one in this situation, sort of, where it is because of him, his household is coming out.
Right.
Because of him. Abram had interceded for Lot, and so Lot gets to bring not only himself, but his whole family out.
Right.
And so their loyalty to him and to his word is now, in a way, vicariously, their loyalty to Yahweh.
Yeah, and this is the pattern we've seen from Noah.
Right.
Was able to bring his family with him on the ark, and then you've got Abram bringing his family, and Lot's part of that even, and so now that gets extended to Lot and his family being taken out of the Exodus.
Yeah, and actually, this might be a good place to bring up Lot's daughters. What if they're not believers? How can they follow Lot and be saved? You know,
right?
And I think, and tell me what your thoughts are here. I think that Lot, he is leading his family in following Yahweh. If his family decides to follow him in following Yahweh, they are being loyal to Yahweh, and they are being part of the saved community. They can decide to break off from Lot and say, we're not following you, we're not following your master Yahweh, and then okay, they've thrown their lot in with Sodom.
Right.
But they are loyal to Yahweh through their following of Lot's leadership towards Yahweh.
Yeah, and I think that's a similar principle that we see even in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ.
Yeah. And so I think with that, there's a lot of talk about how this is a collectivist society rather than an individualistic society like ours. And so, well, yeah, it just makes sense to them that a whole household gets to come into the community of faith or be saved, be brought through something. I think there's something to that, but I think there's also the idea that the entire family is following the loyal leadership at the head of the family.
Right.
So there's something to this that's a little bit individualistic as
Absolutely.
far as like each person is trusting in Yahweh in some way, shape, or form, even if weakly.
Right.
But they are.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Although I don't think it's a bad idea for us to have a better understanding of what a collectivist society really means. I like the idea, but
well, yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, it's a whole different topic. We won't go there right now. Okay, so Lot, as they're coming out of this city and his family, they're told in verse 17 that they are to escape for your life, do not look back or stop anywhere, escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot says to them, oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. So I'll stop there for now. First of all, I just want to point out that word kindness is the word chesed, which we've talked about a lot. That is one of the most repeated attributes of Yahweh throughout the Old Testament. It's his loving loyalty. Through these servants, Yahweh has shown loving loyalty to Lot. The other thing that's important in this section is Lot says a couple times, or at least we hear the phrase a couple times, escape to the hills. And again, we've brought this up earlier in Genesis. I don't really know why this keeps happening, but it does, where that word is translated as plural, hills, plural, but it's actually singular for just one hill. It can also mean mountain. It's the same word. You said this a minute ago.
Right.
And I think in that there might be, again, another connection to the Exodus, to Sinai in particular, actually. Let me read this section for you. It's in Exodus 20, verses 18 through 20. Now, when the people saw the thunder and flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, this is the people at Sinai, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, "You speak to us, we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." So here we have again, the people have come to the mountain where Yahweh is. They're told to come to the mountain. They see the destruction. It's not destruction, but it's still, there's
scary
fire
scene.
and smoke, scary scene. And they fear and they say, "We can't go lest we die."
Oh, it's the same language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had never caught that before.
Yeah, Lot says the same thing in verse 19 where he says, "Lest the disaster overtake me and I die."
Right.
So there's a little bit of added language in there, but there's fear to go to the mountain
Right.
lest we die.
Right.
So I think there's a little bit of, again, parody of the Exodus
Right.
in this.
Yeah.
As both of them are supposed to trust Yahweh and come towards the mountain.
Yeah.
But both of them fear, and the Israelites, they back off and fear even coming close to Yahweh and hearing him, listening to him. Ultimately in Deuteronomy, whenever Moses recounts the story in Exodus, he says that Yahweh said you were right to not come close because you are sinners and ultimately you would bring destruction upon yourself to come near Yahweh. So it turned out to be a grain of wisdom in what they did. Lot here, he should have trusted Yahweh and went to the mountain where he was safe instead of cowering away and going back into, well, we're going to see. He goes into one of these cities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Zor.
Yeah. He says, continuing on in verse 20 in Genesis 19, says, "Behold, this city is near enough to flee to. It's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." And so there's this city that is apparently probably just as bad as Sodom because it's also under threat of this destruction. And he says,
It's just a small town.
Yeah, let's save this one. It's okay.
Yeah. The more I've thought about this, the more interesting it's become just thinking about this negotiation that Lot is having with these angels. And it's just a small town. They're harmless. But then in the next scene, he flees to the hills because he's afraid of living in Zor.
Right. Well, to the caves.
Yeah, the cave.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, I kind of wonder, I think that this might be a call to that Exodus scene because if the destruction is taking place in the city, why are you afraid of the mountain?
Right. Right.
It's just an odd little thing to stick into this narrative.
Yeah, it doesn't. In my mind, it doesn't make sense why. And maybe he's so in love with the city and city life, and he feels like to live in a mountain in a cave just seems miserable, and he won't make it there. I don't know. But it's hard to tell.
I think we mentioned this actually back in Genesis 14, where Sodom is fleeing and hiding down in tar pits in caves.
Right.
And there's this theme throughout Scripture of the oppressed hiding in caves. And so here we have Lot, who fled an oppressive city, was given exodus to the mountain. Instead, he feared that and went back into another oppressive city and ended up fleeing from oppression into a cave.
There's just some irony here that we're meant to see. That
Yeah.
He's like, I don't want to go to the hill, but then he ends up in the hill, in the cave.
Yeah. Yeah, so he ends up there anyway. And with that theme, I feel like there's still something there with the cave that gives it a darker connotation.
Yeah, oh yeah, I think so too.
I think, just say if in this story he went straight to the hill, I don't think the cave would have been part of the story because he's not going into a place to flee oppression.
Right.
He's going somewhere to a new home that Yahweh's going to give him, just like the Israelites.
Because the cave, I don't think is mentioned initially when the angels say go and flee to the hills or to the mountain.
Right.
But he ends up on the mountain in a cave.
So yeah, Lot, he moves into this city of Zoar, and he thought this was going to be a great idea. It's way better than going to the mountain because he's afraid of that. He doesn't last very long there. They are probably just as...
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't Zoar one of the 5 cities that's mentioned in the Battle of 9 Armies?
Chapter 14, verse 2.
There you go.
Yeah, so he intercedes for the city of Zoar, which, yeah, Zoar is mentioned in chapter 14, verse 2. It's part of the confederation of armies that are going to war. Yeah,
It's a sister city of Sodom.
Okay, yeah. One of Sodom's allies. And so it's one of these seed of the serpent nations.
Right.
Just like Sodom. We should have seen this, immediately as soon as you see this name, you look back to chapter 14 and you know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
They're just another oppressive seed of the serpent city. So Lot has to quickly flee into a cave just like many oppressed Israelites will in the future.
So the angels, when Lot lingers, they seize him and his wife and his daughters and rescue them out of the city of destruction. But then immediately Lot is like, I don't want to follow you. I want to go and do what's wise in my own eyes and go to the seat of the serpent city. And they let him do it. They just, they're like, okay. Yeah. But you see, though, like in the very next passage, like he flees there because he realizes at some point he must have realized that was a bad decision.
Yeah, he lets us make our own decisions.
Yeah, bad decisions, and when we lack faith in his wisdom, there's typically consequences to it.
And this was after being implored to not go there.
Right.
As he's going into this city, it says, and this is his safe haven now, so as he's going into this city, in verse 23, the sun had risen on the earth. So it's finally salvation time for those Yahweh is rescuing. And then it says that Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. Now, that word rain, it's matar in Hebrew. It only appears in Genesis 2:5 to refer to the lack of rain on the land, and then it appears in Genesis 7:4 to refer to the rain of the flood, and then here in Genesis 19:24, we don't see it again until Exodus 9, where it occurs 4 times to refer to the raining of hail and fire on Egypt. So that's a clear link. And then it also talks about, it doesn't use the same words in Exodus 9, but it talks about the greenery of the land, all that grew on the ground being destroyed. Here we're told that all that grew on the ground is destroyed in Sodom. So we have fire rain that destroys greenery. Now what's even more significant about that is that in chapter 13, verse 10, we're told that Sodom is like the garden of Yahweh. It's like Egypt. So we have Egypt and Sodom both compared to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And then just completely wiped out by rainfire, or fire rain. And this draws us back to Noah's story as well, because that same word that's been reserved for a lot of these destructive contexts, except for in Genesis 2, it's used again. So again, we have rain bringing destruction and then someone being delivered out.
Well, and if you go back to Genesis 7, it says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarmed on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died." And so it doesn't mention the green, but it mentions the land.
Yeah, I mean, still, I'm pretty sure that in this story and in Exodus as well, it talks about cattle being destroyed and living things, and here all the inhabitants of the city. I think from earlier in the story in the Exodus, it's implied that more things are dying, even though it's not explicitly in the verse we're talking about. So after all this happens in verse 27, Abraham, he comes out, again, early in the morning, so he's kind of in this salvation time, and he comes out and stood before Yahweh, and he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, towards the valley, and he looked and saw the smoke of the land that was coming up like a furnace. And again, I think just following this pattern on through, I think this might correspond to Exodus 14:30, where the Israelites are looking at the dead bodies of the Egyptians on the shore of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
After that, it says in verse 29 that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst to overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. And so again, this whole thing has been because of Yahweh's intercession for Lot. It is because of Abraham that Lot was brought out, and really, I guess, given a chance to display his loyalty to Yahweh and have it tested again.
Yeah, and you see, once again, a parallel to the story of Noah right after the description of what happened in the flood, and all flesh on the earth died. Genesis 8, verse 1, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and livestock that were with him in the ark." And so, yeah, that's interesting, too. You see, God remembered Noah, and because he remembered Noah, he also remembered all the beasts and all of the livestock that were on the ark with him. Mm-hmm. And so the elect one creates a salvation circle around him.
Yeah, it's through his intercession that the others are remembered to get to come out with him, and again, through their loyalty to that elect one, get to display their loyalty to Yahweh. Yeah. And then the same thing happens again in Exodus 2, where Yahweh remembers Israelites. He hears his people, their outcries. Yeah. And so, again, the Exodus happens because he remembers his covenants with his people.
Right, right.
Do you know what I just realized?
What?
We changed the day that we normally record our podcast, and, well, you pointed this out, actually. It's raining again.
Of course.
So we can't get away from it.
No.
So Yahweh has remembered Abraham and other elect ones, and through that, the elect family is brought out along with the elect one and are loyal to Yahweh through their loyalty to Yahweh's elect. Now, Lot here, he actually fears the place he was supposed to go. He fears the mountain, just like the Israelites did, and he intercedes for Zoar, one of these seed of the serpent cities. Just trying to give us a little sum up of where we've been. Well, we learned very quickly that that's a bad choice. Instead, he presumably feels oppressed there, and then he goes to a cave on the mountain. He ends up on the mountain anyway, but I think this addition of the phrase of going to a cave give us some oppressive connotations when it comes to Zoar. So he, in a sense, kind of had another outcry against Zoar.
Yeah. And I mean, gosh, think about where Lot was and where he's come to now. And I mean, being this prominent, possibly a judge, rich, so rich that he couldn't even live in the same land as Abraham, and married, daughters that are engaged, and now, like, he leaves, has nothing, tries to go to another city, maybe he thinks he can rebuild his life there, who knows. Obviously that didn't work out, and so now he's literally in a cave and gets drunk.
Yeah, we have a replay of Noah here with something illicit going on and alcohol.
Yep.
And so, yeah, he gets drunk, passes out, and his daughters, they say, there's no man in the land for us to marry and have children with, which that's probably a little bit dramatic.
Yeah,
I would think. I mean, the entire land that they are in is destroyed. And I want to make a side note here. I think that it's translated as "there's no man in all the earth" a lot of times.
So they bought into a lie.
Well, I just wanted to point out that it's there's the word that's translated as "earth" is the same word for land,
right?
And so it can refer to a smaller region. They're still being overdramatic, but I just want to point out that they have a slightly different idea. There's no man in the valley that was just destroyed. And so, our homes are gone. There's no other guys in the cities we know. Rather than maybe packing our bags and going to go find a new city or some other settlement or go back and find our uncle again, we're going to go, basically, they raped Lot. Just like they were going to be, just like he offered them up for rape in the city.
Yeah.
So they completely reverse the situation in Sodom through the patriarch here, again, getting drunk and then leaving himself vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Yeah, just like Noah did with his wife, and Ham came in and exploited that situation. That really is Lot's final fall, this whole situation, which we should remember that Noah's situation was portrayed as a fall. The situation itself should tell you this was not a good thing, and it was a fall moment, but Noah took the fruit of his garden, and that started this whole situation. Now we have this same situation mirrored by Lot, so it's kind of portrayed as a literary fall here. Yeah. And Lot, he just disappears from the story after this. And that really finishes out again, we've talked about this a little bit, the two goats motif, where one brother is brought closer to Yahweh and sometimes is associated with the sacrifice. And then there is another brother who shows some sort of hostility towards the elect brother, and then he is protected and cast out, or he's exiled into a wilderness, and then he often becomes great nations. Well, Lot, he has been the goat for Azazel in this two goats motif, one of the goats from the Day of Atonement, if you haven't been listening. We talk about this in chapter 4, if you want to go back and listen to that and get a better understanding of that two goats motif. But Lot he hasn't actually wronged or shown any hostility towards Abraham, but he did have his fall away from Abraham. He self-exiled himself twice, really, and was protected by Yahweh out of Sodom, and then he is now becoming a couple of great nations. So again, he mirrors this goat from the Day of Atonement that is cast out to wander. So we should talk a little bit, though, about his grandkids.
Yeah, so what were the two nations that came out of this incestual relationship?
The Ammonites and the Moabites.
Yeah, and so the Moabites become significant because there's a famous Moabite who is Ruth. And Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of King David, obviously, which leads to the Messiah. Mm-hmm. And so if this incestual relationship doesn't happen, we don't get Ruth, we don't get David, we don't get ultimately Christ.
Yeah, at least through that line.
At least through that line. So, yeah, and I think that little detail is significant in this story because it shows us that God's plan is not going to be thwarted by the foolishness and the sinfulness of even his elect people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think probably from the perspective of the author here, too, they look back on the Moabites and they remember some very not good things from the Exodus where they refused to let them into their area and showed hostility towards them. This story, I think, even just furthers that. Like, that wasn't just a mess up in their history, but like they have come from a bad place and are just not good throughout. But then you get to Ruth, and it's a redemption of even this thoroughly dark people.
Yeah, just, it's disturbing.
Yeah, they just have a twisted past from the beginning.
Yeah.
And Yahweh, again, redeems that by taking Ruth and making her part of the elect line that leads to the elect one.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's a beautiful story. But,
yeah.
So, I think that's a good place to wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's good. We'll next time, we're going to actually take a slight break from Genesis and talk about another interpretive principle that's going to help us out as we get to Genesis 22. Everyone probably just went to sleep and said no. But we're going to talk about typology and what that is. It's going to help us out. Yeah, tune into it. It'll be helpful. So we'll see you all then.
All right, sounds good.